Southeast Asia Center here at the LSC. And on behalf of the center, it's a pleasure to welcome our two speakers for today, Dr. Zara Shabrina and Dr. Emma Colvin, both from King's College London, KCL, just next door, or actually physically intertwined with the LSE, it seems. And they'll be speaking about empowering resilience in Jakarta, sinking city. Today's event, I believe, is recorded and will be available on YouTube. And we have people joining us online. So there'll be an opportunity for questions with those through the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. And we'll be filtering those to our speakers along with questions from the room. What else to tell you in terms of housekeeping? If you want to post about this event on social media, please be sure to tag us at SEAC, LSE SEAC, and we're on LinkedIn, Instagram, and we're also on YouTube. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. First, we have Dr. Zara Shabrina, who's an associate professor in spatial data science at King's College London. She received her PhD in urban analytics from the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis at UCL, her MSc in urban planning from University of Southern California, USC, and her bachelor's in urban planning from ITB, Institut Teknologi Bandung. Her research is methodologically grounded in the use of artificial intelligence and urban data science. She's used a range of approaches, including machine deep learning, natural language processing, geographically weighted regression, spatial interaction, and general spatiotemporal models to address critical urban challenges such as we're seeing today. Her thematic interests include platform urbanism and climate sustainability. She's looked at the effects of short-term rental platforms like Airbnb on housing markets, and she's been looking at social media data to study public perception, urban dynamics. And crucially, since 2024, she and Dr. Colvin and other colleagues have been working on empowering resilience in a sinking city, an interdisciplinary research project funded by the British Academy. Then we have Dr. Emma Colvin, who's an urban geographer and lecturer in risk, environment, and society in the Department of Geography at King's College London. Her research explores the politics of adaptation and resilience, the uneven geographies of speculative urban development and digital political ecology. She received her PhD in geography from UCLA in 2018, and her research has been published in a range of leading geography journals like the Annals of the American Association of Geographers, Environment and Planning A, Economy and Space, Environment and Planning C, Society and Space, and Urban Geography. And her work has been cited recently in The Economist. So we're very lucky to have them both here to share with us some of the findings from this huge and very interesting and innovative interdisciplinary research project. Many thanks.
So thank you so much, John, for the introduction, as well as Petra for organizing this event. Thank you everyone for coming in the room, as well as people online as well. So today we are going to talk about our project that has been going on for almost 2 years now, empowering resilience in Jakarta sinking city. And it's not going to be possible without our collaborators. So Resilience Development Initiative in Indonesia, Institut Teknologi Bandung, and the Coloring Cities Research Program based in the Alan Turing Institute, and with the funding from the British Academy ODA International Challenge. So today we are going to talk about some of our reflections, findings from the project itself.
So our research project integrates social science, spatial data science, and artistic engagement to understand flood risk management in Jakarta. So this involves generating building level data using AI and machine learning technologies, flood and land subsidence modeling, as well as the situated experiences, the knowledge and perspective of coastal communities that we've gathered through focus group discussions using photo voice and interviews. And a part of this project also is integrating arts and thinking about performance as a form of knowledge production. So what maybe distinguishes our project from other research projects that seek to engage critically with data-driven approaches to environmental and urban challenges is the fact that we're actively involved in actually creating some of these scenarios and some of the data that will be used in policy. So we're trying to engage with simulations and imaginations of Jakarta's future, not just as objects of analysis, but also as kind of products of our research. And there's a diversity of outputs associated with this research project, so beyond the academic outputs in terms of journal articles, also the creation of a data set, that's publicly accessible, a platform, which we'll talk more about, and then also an art performance that happened in August in 2025 in North Jakarta. So what we'll do today is provide a little bit of context into Jakarta and the research that we've been doing. We'll present the three arguments that we would really appreciate getting your feedback on and have an opportunity to kind of test those today. And then the presentation is broken into three sections. Firstly, talking about knowledge-driven approaches. So here, you might be familiar with the term data-driven. Knowledge-driven is an acknowledgement that data is something that's kind of raw, whereas knowledge is data that's been processed. We'll then talk about empowering resilience and the way we envision this as a particular kind of framework for doing interdisciplinary research. And then finally, we'll close by looking at some of the challenges that we've encountered, that we're still grappling with, and reflecting on where we kind of go from here. So you'll no doubt be familiar with some of the representations of Jakarta as a city that, on the one hand, was highlighted as being one of the world's hottest property markets for luxury property, and has peaked around sort of 2014. But also this competing representation of Jakarta as a very risky city that is one of the world's fastest sinking cities. And as of late 2025, Jakarta is also now one of the most, or the most populous city in the world. So these representations of Jakarta that in many ways are sort of contrasting. On top of this, we have a city that it's very visible that economic inequality is high, and this is borne out in the physical environment, in the landscape of Jakarta. And so here, for example, we see an image in South Jakarta of Pondok Indah, and we can see on the left-hand side, sort of supposedly kind of informal, unplanned settlement, the kampungs, and then the more formalized private development on the right-hand side. So these real kind of contrasts between social and spatial categories of the city.
So within our project, we try to explain in terms of why Jakarta is sinking, and we're looking at it in terms of different perspectives. And if you can see in the map over here, it's a digital elevation map of Jakarta. It goes from red to green, in which red colors means that you have higher elevation. The green color means that Jakarta has lower elevation. So we can see that the southern part of Jakarta is has a higher elevation, and it goes as you go towards the northern part of Jakarta. It's a low-lying kind of like deltaic type of topography, in which then you have the North Jakarta that faces directly to the North Java Sea. So in terms of Jakarta itself, from the topography side, we see that Jakarta is a low-lying delta crossed by 13 rivers. So if you see in the maps, all the white lines are the rivers. You can see how it's embedded into the urban fabrics, all these different rivers that goes through the city. And the sinking of Jakarta is also a result of different things. Some studies have highlighted that the main reason of Jakarta sinking is the weight of the built environments. So the amount of buildings and development that has been developed throughout the years, as well as the expansion of the groundwater wells. So groundwater extraction is one of the main elements in terms of the use of clean water in Jakarta, as well as the remaking of the city itself. So how Jakarta has been developed throughout the years, from the past to the present, has undergone all this kind of like unplanned sprawl development as well. And we can see statistically that more than 60% of Jakarta inhabitants rely on groundwater. Why that is? Because also there is an inequality in terms of the pipe water network system. So we'll be able to see some areas without access to pipe water at all. And even the affluent communities, sometimes when being faced in terms of choosing between pipe water or groundwater extraction, they might want to choose the groundwater extraction due to the quality of the pipe water as well. So pipe water in Jakarta serves fewer than 1 million households from a total of 4 million households, so only serving around a quarter of the communities in the city.
So we know that land subsidence and groundwater extraction are really important for Jakarta to address, but for many years, the cause of land subsidence was really quite contested, particularly among policymakers, and this really slowed any meaningful action. being taken by the government. Efforts actually primarily were directed at addressing the risk of flooding and trying to alleviate flooding through the use of hard infrastructure. And so as we see here on the left-hand side, building seawalls, but also polder systems, sluice gates, and so on. So the provincial and the national governments were both involved in these efforts. Meanwhile, efforts to regulate groundwater extraction have been implemented in recent years, but in quite an uneven way. Enforcement of regulations has been a big challenge, and so that remains quite uneven. So this focus really, as I said, has been on hard infrastructure approaches to flooding rather than thinking about how to actually regulate groundwater extraction. And what this means is that we have, particularly in North Jakarta, which is where our fieldwork is based, we have a situation where the infrastructure that does exist, on the one hand, is not addressing the core issue of land subsidence because it's just addressing the threat of flooding, but it's also shaping the experiences of communities in very different ways and in sometimes quite unexpected or unintended ways. So on the left here, we have the seawall, which actually was topped in 2007. And when there are tidal floods, it's quite common for communities in the north to experience flooding. So this can be on a weekly basis. This is quite ordinary for them. But then also a lot of the efforts to reinforce the seawall along North Jakarta have actually really disrupted the lives of fishing communities. So this image on the right-hand side is showing you a bamboo bridge that I believe has since now been taken apart. But at the time when we were doing fieldwork in 2024, this was put into place so that communities could actually traverse the landscape that was being very disrupted by the construction of new seawalls. And so this was to actually enable people just to function and be able to access the sea, access their boats, and so on. So today we want to present 3 arguments, now that we've given you a bit of context for thinking about Jakarta and the sort of challenges that are associated with the city. So the first argument we want to make is that data or knowledge-driven approaches to urban governance are really valuable for effectively and powerfully representing very complex socio and environmental challenges. However, incomplete data sets have the potential to reinforce existing socio-spatial inequalities. And additionally, if we narrowly define what we mean by data or what we mean by knowledge, which often in the context of policy and talk of data-driven solutions is often taken to mean quantitative data, spatial data, this can really obscure the lived experiences, which are very differentiated, of communities that are often most at risk and most vulnerable. So second, in response to this kind of acknowledgement on the one hand of the power of data, but also some of the pitfalls, our interdisciplinary approach aims to empower resilience by broadening definitions of what we mean by data on the one hand, but also by actively and continually centering social justice. So this builds on our understanding of data as something that is politically and socially constructed, and of the knowledge production process as inherently political. And finally, the third argument that we want to present is that integrating different data sets, whether that's spatial data, visual data, experiential embodied data, this presents challenges of incommensurability. So it might be the case actually that it's not always possible to render compatible the different forms of data we have about the risk of flooding or experiences of flooding. And we'll talk more about what we mean by this. But we want to argue that actually our role perhaps is to embrace those tensions and those frictions between data sets rather than trying to flatten out or eradicate those ontological differences.
So with that in mind, we would like to start with this argument that data or knowledge has the power to drive decision-making. When we started the project and we went to Jakarta, we spent around, in total, around 3 months in Jakarta in the past two years during the project. And then what we see, a lot of different policies that has been implemented has been using either kind of like outdated plans or outdated data set, or maybe no data set at all. And so we're thinking that perhaps this is some sort of a gap that we would be able to come into, that data can be used to generate insights. It can be used to model phenomena. It can be used to communicate urgency. So this problem of the sinking Jakarta is something that is really urgent and affects a lot of different people. And we would like to use the power of numbers to kind of like communicate this urgency as well as to make it visual, because sometimes it's easier to talk using kind of numbers as well as maps, statistics, and so on. And we realized that in this era of big data, data comes in various forms. So we use also data in various forms, geospatial, textual, visual data, to understand the urban context with leveraging all kind of big data out there. And data-driven here is not purely seen as technical process, but as socio-technical systems. Data is embedded in our everyday life. It's been produced via lots of different sources. It's transforming work and economy, the nature and consumption in Jakarta, management of governance and society, communication and interaction. So it's embedded in the everyday life, and we can leverage that and use it to be able to understand in terms of the problem of the sinking Jakarta. So we will then present the different ways that we have used data to try to understand the sinking Jakarta. The first one was using the remote sensing data, so Landsat 5, 7, and 9, to try to look at how Jakarta has been developed throughout the years. So this is the one in red is the development of the built area, or what we call the normalized difference built-up index, or NDBI, from 1990 to 2024. So we can see that in 1990, in terms of development, it keeps on expanding and growing up to 2024. Most of Jakarta has been turned into built-up areas. And we also be able to see, on the other hand, the loss of the green spaces. So as we can see here in 1990s, we have some green spaces in southern part of Jakarta, on the northwestern as well as northeastern part of Jakarta. And it's kind of like going less and less throughout the years up until 2024. So this kind of data set, when presented to, for example, policymaker, could communicate some sort of urgency in terms of how many green spaces that we have lost so far, as well as how much development that has been happening in Jakarta. And also we model how fast Jakarta is sinking using land subsidence modeling. So this is using the Sentinel-1 data and using LIXBAS. I'm not going to go into too much details in terms of the technical modeling. Actually, we'll have another talk at UCL tomorrow to talk about the modeling, GeoAI, and so on. But it's really just a showcase in terms of the use of the data here, in terms of looking at the rate of land subsidence in Jakarta. So if you see the first map on the left, all the red areas are the one in which land subsidence is quite prominent. And it's also using different methods, so masked and unmasked. So there's some sort of uncertainties in terms of the modeling. But in Muara Baru, North Jakarta, for example, we could see land subsidence around 6 centimeters annually. And in the northwestern region, around 3 centimeters annually. And if we see the graph over here, there has been a rapid increase in terms of the land subsidence, especially in the northwestern area. But then if we see the policy, for example, for the groundwater-free zones, which was introduced in 2021, they are all concentrated in central Jakarta. So data can be used to look into suitability of policies, for example, to be able to see where is the mismatch in terms of where things are happening and where policies are implemented. But we also really try to highlight that data can be seen as social and political construct. This is also apparent in the case of trying to look at the available data from different sources. So we realize that missing or inaccessible data often result from technical limitations, political choices, or social exclusion. And if we use the data that have some missing data, it could be that we're creating blind spot in terms of the analysis or the policies. So you see here there are 5 maps on the right. The first map is the map from the government of Indonesia. Jakarta 1 is the geospatial data portal for Jakarta. And this is Muara Angke, which is our study area. And if you can see over here on the top, we are looking at the building delineation, so looking into the building level data set. And there is a huge gap missing on the northern part of that particular area because the data is outdated. It was updated in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. So then if we're using that to model our analysis of the sinking city, we are losing this big chunk of community, which is at the forefront of the climate crisis. They are the marginalized community, they are the most vulnerable, and they're not going to be in the analysis because such data is not available. That's why in doing our analysis, we then check different kind of sources. So we compare between, for example, Google, Microsoft, OpenStreetMap, and Overture. Some of them are from companies, private companies. OpenStreetMap is a crowdsourcing type of data set, and we're able to see the difference in terms of the completeness. We can see that Microsoft doesn't really have the data in Mora Anke, for example, maybe because they have no use for that particular data or user for it. So we also need to think about who produced the data and for what purpose, because it also leads to the question who holds the power as well in terms of understanding all these communities. So in terms of data itself, through evidence-based planning, decision often rely on quantitative analysis. So we do, as a researcher, we have that responsibility to make sure that it is based on reliable data set that are validated. And if the data is being modeled, then we need to acknowledge there might be blind spots or biases because of that. Incomplete data both reflects and reinforces existing inequalities and might obscure lived experience of risk. For example, if we're using the incomplete data set from the government. So we were then able to create around 20, to collate some of them through modeling and so on, around 27 data sets related to the sinking Jakarta. Here we have the maps of 19 of them. And if we see it from 19 data sets collated, 9 are model data set that comes with its own biases, limitations, and so on. So they're from remote sensing, GIS operations, and so on. 7 are statistics from the census, 1 from crowdsourced data set, and only 2 from the government agency. So it raises questions on uncertainties, limitations, and bias when used in urban modeling and used to as a base for policy formulation. And we try then to keep asking the question in terms of when we do urban models in data scarce environments, who do we render invisible? And can we do something to make sure that all this effort in terms of the data modeling can be transparent, can be reused, and can be useful for other people who would like to do similar studies? And so we are really pushing towards this open data, open science effort in terms of trying to see if such data are available, what kind of things that people can produce. So we tested out our data set by uploading our data to Zenodo and just keep it open for some times, just to make sure also while we're also validating the data, making sure the data are in high quality and so on. And then using this open data and open science component, which means that people would be able to see how we produce the data. They will be able to see the methodology. They will be able to use it in other analysis. So it could be feed forward to other studies as well. And we make sure that we hold kind of like this data set, ensure that they are ethical, inclusive, and reliable as well. So people would be able to see it's well documented, there is validation and uncertainty analysis. And then we hold this event, which is a hackathon. It's a hack for resilient reimagining urban futures. So we open the data set to the hackathon participants, and they are coming from a lot of different backgrounds. They're from governments, NGOs, academics, private sectors, and they get a hold of the data, and with the skills and knowledge, they were able to create something out of it. And it highlights this open data and civic activism approach to knowledge production, or we can say knowledge co-production, and how can we improve our understanding of Jakarta sinking city in terms of looking into perhaps some sort of like solution or policy-based analysis out of it. And it's a competition, so 3 people actually selected as winners, and it was really amazing and new experience in terms of like all these processes, meeting a lot of people with different perspective, skills that went together and tried to solve this problem. Maybe not solve, understand the problem of sinking Jakarta. And then we got 3 winners. And the first winner, they transformed this old device into monitoring station. So it's an early warning system using old cell phones, which we thought was amazing. And they provided also kit to trained communities, so they would be able to transform it themselves and make it as a grassroots movement to be able to do this early warning system. The second winner, they created a platform, and it's a research platform. So then the communities, because they are heavily researched, there are a lot of researchers coming to these communities. So they will be able to see what other research that has been going on, what are the results, all in one platform, which is really a knowledge platform that we think would be very, very valuable for the case of Jakarta sinking city. And the third winner designed this toolkit for alley design solutions, in which they would be able to turn alleyways, because there's a lot of alleys in informal settlements, into these permeable surfaces, and they would be able to calculate, for example, the cost of turning the alleyways. And this could also be used for the government to be able to transform some of the communities in Jakarta, again, from community perspective.
So the second argument, and related to this point about how do we kind of refine data sets and think about addressing blind spots, we want to propose a kind of framework, and we're calling it Empowering Resilience. This was the name of the research project, but also playing off of the idea of powering through kind of data, but also empowering in terms of centering communities. And so on the one hand, what we're trying to do is broaden definitions of data and how data gets used and translated into policy. So thinking not just about the spatial data sets and how do we test those, but how do we integrate other forms of knowledge? So experiential or embodied knowledge, storytelling, memories, visual methods. And then at the same time, how do we consistently center communities and make sure that a critical understanding of resilience is something that we don't want to celebrate necessarily, but we see as a response to structural conditions. How do we kind of embed this into our work and our approach to data consistently? So part of this, and I'll talk more about this in a second, was working with artists to think about performance and community collaboration as a way of generating new forms of data. And this performance was called The Placenta, the Turtle, and the Spy. And this was a small bottle that was given out to participants who came along. And inside the bottle are pieces of fishing net, of shells, of wood, pieces of the community, the built environment, and a little note attached to it, which encourages us to imagine if the parameters of data could be opened up to think about different ways of understanding, in this case, data, the community of data. So one of the ways that we sought to not just understand blind spots in the data, but to sort of integrate other forms of knowing and to enrich that data, to complicate spatial data, was to think about integrating the experiences of communities in 2 Jakarta, North Jakarta neighborhoods, Kamamura and Impluit. And so we had a team of researchers who used interviews and focus groups, but also photo method. And so this was an activity where they would walk with young people from the neighborhoods who were about 18 to 25. And people from the community, they would have taken photographs of places that were important to them around the neighborhood. And then they would go on a walking tour and talk about these places. And this enabled the team to really kind of understand the way that young people were understanding their position in the city, how they understood flooding, how they understood risk, also how they demonstrated resilience and expressed joy and talked about the memories and all of these different forms of data that you can't really get out of a map necessarily, or certainly not the kinds of maps that we've been producing otherwise. We also collaborated with two Jakarta-based artists, Tita Selina and Owen Ahmed. And they brought together a team of Jakarta residents, some of whom, like Def here on the left, were graphic designers, others were researchers, mothers, people who were involved in activism. And they put together a performance that happened in Jakarta in August, as I mentioned. And so this enabled us to think about the role of performance and artwork as a way of generating new knowledge. And so this is an extract from the narration of the event, where one of the women was reading this to the audience. So she said, and this was performed in Indonesian, this is the translation. Numbers are clear, they show the threats looming over us in the city. So here it's very much representing what we were talking about, the power of data to kind of visualize problems, to really potentially communicate urgency. But as they go on to say, yet no graph records the last fisherwoman displaced for a lifetime by the rot of development. So the last fisherwoman is an actual woman in North Jakarta who they've been working with to collect her kind of oral histories. You can't really see her very clearly here, but she's wearing like a house on her head. And it's this very kind of comical almost recording of her sitting in her home with this house on her head, talking about the stories of her life. And it's a very, very different understanding and kind of perception of what it means to be a woman and to be a fisherwoman in particular in North Jakarta. And so we sort of had this representation. They played this video to the audience. We had maybe 200 people come to the performance, 100, 200 community members. People were also bused from central Jakarta to North Jakarta. And that journey is one that not many people would ordinarily make. North Jakarta is not a place that many people would necessarily go to unless they live there or they're researchers, I suppose. So this was part of bringing people to North Jakarta and showing them these stories. But we also have here on the left, Def, who was one of the performers. As I mentioned, he's a graphic designer, and he was very nervous about being involved as a performer in this piece, but he really kind of stepped up and threw himself into it. And so here we have in the background, there are images of land subsidence rates. So there's a map that, to a lot of people in Jakarta who are familiar with these conversations, this map is very recognizable. But in the foreground, in a swimming pool in a warehouse in North Jakarta that the team had constructed, they had to bus in clean water because the water there would not be clean enough for them to perform in. He then took on the role of kind of trying to perform land subsidence rates and respond to the graphs through his body. And so he performed over a couple of minutes in the water, kind of moving through the water, using his body to kind of represent this relationship to land subsidence. And so this links to this third argument that we want to make, and that's that clearly there are these inherent kind of tensions between different data sets. On the one hand, we want to be aware of blind spots, but on the other hand, we don't want to suggest that we can just fill those in and somehow provide a God's eye view of Jakarta. We know this isn't really possible. There's on the one hand the allure of providing spatial data, or providing complete data sets, of providing a data platform that is kind of mirrors this kind of technological fix, the idea that we can kind of resolve all of these very complex issues if we just had enough data or if we just had enough transparency. But we know that their grounded realities is a lot more complicated. And one of the challenges is how do we actually think about integrating, for example, the experiential knowledge, the embodied knowledge, the really complex stories that emerge through the performance that are really hard for me to even try and do justice to now when I have the space to tell you about them. And I think that really what this comes down to is a question of incommensurability between these different data sets. And maybe actually we should be embracing that rather than trying to neatly shove everything into a digital platform, which could actually risk flattening out a lot of the complexity and the detail and the uncertainty that runs through all of these data sets. Maybe we should be embracing this. And so these images are showing you on the left-hand side, the performance. So the beginning of the performance, we watched this is a turtle who is based on a real turtle who was gifted to the artists by people in the community who were worried that he wouldn't survive anymore because he couldn't access the sea because of the seawall. So this is based on a real turtle, and we watched the turtle come in to Jakarta Bay with the performers inside. So this kind of pilgrimage that we took from where the buses dropped us off to the seawall, but then watching this turtle arrive as the sun set. And it also was the week after Independence Day. So there was lots of red and white flashing lights around Jakarta Bay. So we're watching this turtle come in against the backdrop of real estate redevelopment as well. And then there was a moment where they were transporting the turtle over the seaboard. And so this, you can maybe imagine, this is really hard work. And so they had these bamboo kind of levers to help, but it's incredibly heavy turtle. And so I wanted to try and tell you a little bit about what this was like to be taking a bus with air conditioning, like with our phones and with Wi-Fi, then to be kind of turned out in North Jakarta, where a lot of the community members are looking around like, what are you all doing here? And we're clearly with a kind of art crowd. And then we have this turtle that we watched come in, and people got involved and physically helped to transform, to take him over the seawall. But I think that moment of kind of looking at how the seawall was really disrupting that relationship between the human and the non-human world. And then the community carried this turtle, which, as you mentioned, Brian, the alleyways are very narrow. We've got this turtle like swiping the sides of people's buildings and stuff, and kids grabbing out to touch it and wanting to have a relationship with it. And so, like, how do we possibly distill all of this down as an experience, as a story about North Jakarta, into a neat kind of presentation, let alone a platform? And the turtle is now resting, as far as I know, is still in a warehouse in North Jakarta as kind of an artifact of this performance. So this was the poster from the performance. This is left on the left-hand side. The yellow is they're taking on the stripes from the turtle. And Ari Kura Mata, meaning the spy, the turtle, and the placenta. And so these in themselves are all separate comments about the role of kind of flooding and shaping North Jakarta. Spies being an auto-critique around drone imagery, around satellites, around what we know and how we represent communities. The turtle I've mentioned, and then the placenta being a commentary on the practice of burying placentas by families in North Jakarta, but also drawing a parallel between North Jakarta as a placenta for the rest of the city. So kind of giving life to the rest of the city, but also being kind of discarded at the same time. And these are some of the performers and also just members of the community, young people that wanted to be involved. And this is in Dalat, which is a very kind of politically organized community. Yeah, so finally, some sort of challenges and reflections. Firstly, the fact that data clearly has this power to kind of communicate urgency and create potentially more reliable policy interventions. And as Zara mentioned, a lot of the interventions that have been sort of pursued in Jakarta have often been guided by either a total lack of data or very outdated or very impartial data sets. But we also need to be aware of the inherent uncertainties, limitations, and biases in data that we can never really resolve. We can never really get rid of those. There also is this inherent tension between the allure of the technical fix of just providing enough data, and therefore we can solve the problem, and then the grounded realities of Jakarta, and indeed of any city or any community, any site. And then finally, this question of incommensurability of different data sets and what it means to embrace this. And what that then means for as we move forward with this project, and we do have these data sets and they will circulate and they will be publicly available, how do we then shape or think about the way that this shapes policy making and decision making? And arguably, like, is that even our role to have? So thank you so much.
So just to mention about our team, just to thank everyone within the team, so our researchers in RDI, as well as at King's as well, our advisory boards, and the artists, Salina and Irwan Ahmed, who did that turtle and the Ari Kura Matahata. And if you want to know more about the project, we have the website, sinking-city.com. We still need to put in a lot of different things inside the website. We'll try to update it as we go along, and as well as our platform. So we created a platform. It's called Coloring Indonesia. So it maps out every single building in Jakarta, and you'll be able to see some of the building typologies. This is also work in progress. We're still in the process of completing the data set as well. So that's it. Thank you.
Time to open up for questions. So you just want to bundle a couple questions?
Yeah, we can take a few in the room and then maybe online.
Yeah. Okay. Questions?
Thank you so much. This was a fantastic talk and gave me so much to think about. If it's okay, I have two questions. Up to you whether you want to answer both or not. So the first is very much about you working together as a quantitative geographer and qualitative geographer. And you gave us, I really like this idea of the incommensurability of the data sets, which is still, I seem to understand, an open question, but it might remain so, maybe not. So my questions are both about this. On the one hand, I'm curious to know, and perhaps egoistically more from Emma's side, because I'm also a qualitative researcher, but also maybe from Zara's side, working with qualitative researcher, how the dynamic was in very much also pragmatically on the ground, because I think it's brilliant to see a project that integrates both perspectives. And I think in geography oftentimes they're separated, as well as in other social sciences. So maybe I'd like to know a bit more about the kind of behind the scene of this working together. Maybe some of the challenges or the things that you found really, really valuable in the collaboration. And the second point was, I mean, not really a question per se, but more, I was curious to know if you had thought about it, of using videos or filmmaking to perhaps even to integrate the different data sets. And as I was looking at your presentation, I was thinking about some of the work of forensic oceanography as part of forensic architecture at Goldsmith. And there is this video, which I always show to my students because it's brilliant, that's called The Left to Die Boat. And of course, it comes from a project that was a much, much smaller data set than the one you showed, but it integrates quantitative and qualitative analysis. And so, yeah, just a question I was curious if you had considered video making as a way.
Should we jump into this one and then?
Yeah.
I mean, with the video thing, we didn't show it, but we do have some videos that Titano and their primary mode of, I mean, I guess they do a lot of installation and performance work, but often what that translates to as an output is video. So we do actually have some videos, but I would love to know more about how to do that. Yeah, as regards to working together, I can share my own reflections but do you want to start?
You can start.
I mean, I think so Zara had approached me before when she knew I was coming to King's, and so I feel very kind of fortunate that we were able to kind of hit the ground running as soon as I arrived. But I think to be really honest about it, like I think that the way that my observations at least is the way that spatial data scientists work and the way that qualitative researchers work, the temporalities and the stages of your work is very different. So from the get-go, Zara and her team have been producing like incredible data sets and just so productive all the time, like continually producing new things and analyses and just like a lot of productivity, whereas the qualitative data can be really slow. And so I felt a lot of like, to be really honest, I felt a lot of like insecurity and around like, oh gosh, what am I like contributing to this project? Because she has all these big data sets and like, and it took a lot longer for that to accumulate. Also, our colleague, Dityo, he is the one that runs the, so Dityo here, he was the one overseeing the kind of qualitative data. And what my role was to sort of coordinate with Tita and Erwin and to understand how we could integrate artwork, which also was a very weird process because then I sort of felt like a manager rather than a researcher in a lot of ways. So that also was quite an important lesson, I think, in like letting go of ego and being like, well, I'm here as a facilitator and I'm not here to be the one like quote unquote producing the knowledge, which was quite interesting. So I think, I don't know if you have other thoughts about.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like every data scientist should work with a qualitative geographer. It just gives that other perspective in terms of giving it nuance, in terms of usually I always work behind a computer, and sometimes it's very hard to then think about it as a grounded, thing. It's all numbers, it's all data, it's buildings, it's statistics and all that. And really just doing interdisciplinary projects, going into the communities, I now lean towards more kind of like, okay, critical data studies, perhaps critical geography, digital geography, sorry. So thinking more critically about things, about biases, uncertainties. What does it mean about kind of like representation and stuff like that? And I feel that I didn't have that 2 years ago before starting the project. So I feel like the collaboration has been great. And even though Emma said like, oh, what am I contributing? Actually, she's contributing so much. And she's into, we actively discuss a lot of different things within kind of like the data perspective. And it's good to be able to be questioned on the things that usually if I present to a data scientist, urban analytics, or different audience, it's not going to be challenged as much as if it's different audience. So I feel like it has been all really positive in a way that we are both being challenged to go outside our comfort zones. And it has been a great collaboration so far. Hopefully we'll have other
and I want to be able to ask those questions too, of like, sometimes to be the person that's like, I literally don't understand what we're talking about right now. Can we use a different language? Like, can you explain? And it might be something that seems so basic to a spatial data scientist, but then it enables you to have a conversation about, well, why is that the assumption, or like, why do we start from there? And I guess I would also say that our research assistants have been phenomenal. Like, I could not recommend working with them enough. And Asa and Nabila, for example, so Abe and Nabila are both kind of cultural anthropologists. That's their training. Asa is much more like AI and data science, but he became very interested in the social science stuff. And they actually went with Tita and Erwan to one of the islands, and they were there for some of the work that they were doing in kind of preparation for the performance, and they were involved in that. And so I think actually they were really integral to embodying that integration a bit more, whereas we're sort of interlocutors across these disciplines. They actually were able to kind of engage more directly with both sides, which has been really, really interesting to see. And I think like us is amazing. So we love our research team. They're really incredible.
Yeah, thank you. I would also like to ask about this tension between qualitative data and how you perceive this gap, like between what consultants and urban planners would like to see, or like what they want in their everyday work, and what you deliver with this project. I think it was interesting how you framed the project in the first part around like data-driven approaches, which I think is like quite a hegemonic discourse at the moment. Like, we need more data, we need better data, and so on. So I would ask, is there like a point to refuse this discourse and resist this in the first place? And then I would be curious to hear whether the kind of data that you try to integrate, like whether you understand this is from counter discourse or counter knowledge, or whether you would try to align this knowledge, like make it palpable to policymakers in a way that they can like digest it and work with it.
Well, we tried to work quite closely with different stakeholders. We actually started the project with a workshop. We invited academics, we invited people from the government, and instead of us presenting to them, we asked them to present to us. It's kind of like, okay, do the work, just gather everyone in the same place. They present in terms of what is it that they have been doing, as well as what data do they have, and we just take notes. And I think that was quite like a good strategy in terms of knowing what is currently happening without going to all these different institutions and so on, because it's just one day where everyone is there, was there. And I think that was a good.
Remembering Owen's intervention in that. But...
and then the artist came as well, and he was asking all these nice questions, challenging each other, and everything. So in terms of the information that we produce, we feel like some information are more relevant to this community or like that government and so on. So throughout the process that we went back and forth in Jakarta to Jakarta, as we mentioned, spending around like 3 months in Jakarta in separate locations. But then during those 3 months, we went to communities, we talked to different institutions, we talked to academics, we talked to a lot of different people, because I think this project is a ground. I feel we're just trying to put like a solid foundation for further research. It seems like how to make sure that all the data are kind of like good, the algorithms, we have everything very structured, and then going to the communities and looking into the I don't know, like the progress, the process throughout the 2 years. There has been many changes and all that. But yeah, it's been challenging, but also interesting at the same time to just approach different people differently and try to gather knowledge as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think it sort of links to I meant to say this in response to Julia's comment, but one of the things that's been really insightful for me around the work that Zara does is that it does gain the attention of policymakers and it does get you a seat at the table. So that can be strategically used, I think, in that sense. But I do think you're raising this broader question of like, what are our ethical and political commitments as researchers, and how do we want to position ourselves relative to policymakers and more specifically the state? I'm gonna censor myself a little bit here, but like, I mean, and I think that's something we haven't resolved yet. There's a way of moving forward with this project where we would really invest in building relationships to state agencies, for example, and ministries, and start thinking about how do we translate all of the work that we've done, potentially with the experiential and the community-based engagement being more supplementary and more enriching, but primarily leading with the data. There's also a way that we could go forward where we totally refuse that and we ally with communities, right? So I think it is an open question. The question of like, do we want to refuse the idea of data-driven or knowledge-driven narratives? I think the way we've thought about it so far is to open it up rather than totally refuse it. So to reclaim it and to remake it. But I also think, you know, just in our engagements in Jakarta, one of the things that really stands out to me is when I first began working with Zara, like as someone who is incredibly well connected because you were trained in Indonesia and obviously speaks fluent Indonesian and is Indonesian, this changes things. And I was like, wow, like so many doors are being opened, like we can get meetings and interviews that I could never get as an outsider. Then you see how things progress and actually like you can have a meeting, but maybe nothing comes of it. Or maybe people don't turn up or they let you down, or like there's not actually the relationship you thought was there with the state. So I think it's a little bit, I guess I just am trying to express like how uncertain it can be and how fraught that can be. And so that actually made me think more about, I would rather move forward with a research approach that aligns with my values rather than try and compromise myself to work with state agencies that may or may not actually want to work with me. But I do think it's an open question. There's different ways forward. There you go.
I have I think, related question but from an old man, from a different discipline, from data science or geography. The first is the data that you showed us, the way it was organized and represented was maps from a bird's eye view. And it reminded me of two old scholars. One, Edward Tufte, who wrote many years ago about the visual representation of quantitative data. And he always, in some of his beautiful books, he would always go back to this incredible map that was produced in the aftermath of Napoleon's ill-fated campaign.
Yeah,
you know,
such a great map.
Yeah, and so the map, you know, you see space, you see that the campaign as they head towards Moscow and then retreat. You see temperature, and you see, you know, the casualties. You see the declining, you know, numbers in his army. And I wonder if there are other ways that are not, you know, I mean, if you're talking about syncing, it's quite striking to me that all the visual representations are bird's eye view rather than, you know, the opposite, vertical. Like why is that the perspective? And then the other thing to sort of build on the preceding question is, I mean, why do we assimilate the notion of knowledge into the notion of data? Like, is one accepting all sorts of things, if one assumes that the only form of knowledge that is, we should take seriously, it consists of data. Historians collect data, anthropologists collect data. Should we talk about all these different forms of knowledge in terms of data? And that reminded me of the often cited book by James C. Scott, Seeing Like a State, in which the bird's eye view is the view of the state, of rendering the world legible so you can intervene and interfere with it in various ways. But he talks in the book about another kind of knowledge that he describes using an old Greek term, metis. And I'm wondering whether in your encounters, in your field work in North Jakarta, you encountered people who had other forms of knowledge that you might want to call data, but you might also say, fuck data. Well, this is another kind of knowledge that has not only a legitimacy, but a significance beyond lived experience, which all sorts of people now use this term lived experience. Oh, that's lived experience, or there's culture, or there's artistic production, but it's kind of a residual category that isn't given the status of knowledge. Here at the London School of Economics and Data Science, I mean, it's like, is there another way of thinking about knowledge that you encounter on the ground that is politically valid and worthy of support on the ground, standing up as opposed to looking down, worm's eye view, or standing, to go to Welcome Trust, their exhibit, these people standing in their kitchens. They have these photos of people standing in their flooded kitchens from all the continents around the world, standing in their flooded kitchens. Like from that perspective.
So just to answer, because we couldn't fit all the stuff here. Actually, we also have another strand of research, especially using data, where we look at data, for example, from like a street view imaginaries. So we collected around maybe 50,000 street view imaginaries, and it's all around Jakarta within formal and informal settlements, and would be able to see, for example, the streets. So we'd be able to see the component of the streets and so on, to look at the risk for flooding in a different way. So we're trying to go beyond the bird eye view. It's just that within this presentation, that's the one that gets shown. So we also use, for example, for our, maybe Emma could talk about it a bit more, like the photo voice method, in which we give camera to communities so then they can take pictures from their perspective in terms of what they think about risk, what they think about vulnerabilities and all that. So we do try, and that's a really good point that you're saying in terms of data is not just a macro perspective. So within the project, we actually divide our analysis within kind of like the data bit into micro, meso, and macro perspective. So we're looking at it from kind of like a unit perspective, building perspective, street perspective, as well as looking at it from the neighborhood perspective, as well as the urban, like city perspective, because we want to be able to see when we go in different scales, what do we get from it? Changing between different scales. As a geographer, of course, so we know that uncertainties come when dealing with different scales. And the data itself, that's why we use like geospatial, textual, as well as visual data. We try to combine a lot of different things, so then we gain more perspective rather than less. But yeah, I think within the talk itself, we were just viewing the one that showcased the use of data, but what we didn't show was actually that different level of scales that we also been using, the different type of data set that we have been collected and analyzed to be able to understand things and so on.
Yeah, and I think your question about, it gets to this question, you use the phrase of like palatable, like rendering palatable or rendering legible, and of our complicity in that. So we are producing scenarios and models that are going to be more readily taken up than us offering a 2-hour performance, right, of stories. So I think we have a role to play, and we have to think about that. And how do we choose to respond to that? And I guess one of the challenges, particularly around thinking about like James C. Scott, of the way that we are rendering communities in North Jakarta more legible and potentially more governable in ways that might not be desirable is something we have to really think about. And I wonder, I think it's more of an open question. I think we have to discuss this more amongst us, between ourselves, of how we're thinking about ways of moving forward. And to me, it does come back to this question of like, how do you engage with this, with the state and with policy making and really with the politics of what you're doing? Do you like throw your hands up and say like, I don't want any part of this, which is maybe a more cynical take on like refusing to be complicit in the state, like in the state's actions, because we already are complicit by producing these things? Or do you try and be strategic? Or do you try and be more oppositional in thinking about resurrecting some notion of like Matisse? I think the challenge as well with the platform, for example, one of the ways we thought about integrating some of the knowledge was, well, I mean, this is still an open question, but if you were to be able to, where do I go on here? I think it's fallen asleep. With the platform, obviously this is a platform that primarily shows and prioritizes the spatial data. There could be ways that you could integrate, for example, stories or you know, the photographs that you have taken, that we could take parts of the performance, but it's always secondary to the spatial data. And you're okay. Yeah. And even in terms of thinking about how the project was structured and the funding, most of the funding necessarily goes to the spatial data, right? And so I think there's all of these asymmetries. And I think I don't think we have a clear way of resolving that. Like, even if we were to talk about Matisse and to break open what we mean by lived experience and to enrich that more, I don't think that's ever going to get us a seat at the table in terms of policy making. But maybe that's not the goal of the project. Maybe it's something else entirely. So thank you for raising that. And I think James C. Scott's work is really instructive in highlighting the dangers of what we could be doing by making things more legible and becoming complicit in mapping communities that maybe have benefited from not being fully legible or not being fully mapped. And I guess there's the other point about data versus knowledge. We're drawing on that primarily from spatial data science, data being something that's raw and unanalyzed versus knowledge being some form of analysis. But that doesn't necessarily translate into social science fields in a way that is, yeah, that makes sense maybe to us.
Yeah, and there are some literature in terms of looking into kind of like data-driven versus knowledge-driven or whatever driven. And it seems that I think what we're trying to do in the project is to rethink what we think data might be. And I think this is the debate that occurs in a lot of different aspects of our lives as well, in terms of, do we think this as data? Is it not data? Does it have to be data? And all that. And yeah, I find myself questioning that a lot now as well, in terms of understanding. So what do you mean by data? For me personally, subjectively, I would prefer kind of like knowledge-driven instead of data-driven, because then data-driven might be that, you know, not all data are useful type of things. But again, I think it's heavily debated concept, it seems like.
We have a question online.
I'm not sure why the screen froze, but I'll try.
Oh, it froze. Okay.
Can get.
And we have another question from the audience.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting. I'm from Jakarta and I happen to be studying urbanization here at the LSE. And I kind of wanted to build a little bit on that discussion on kind of engagement with policymakers, but a little bit more broadly. I'm interested in your choice of using resilience as a framework. I think anyone here who grew up in Jakarta or has familiarity with kind of policymaking in Indonesia can understand how, you know, despite evidence, knowledge, data, whatever you may call it, policymakers can continue to be quite lax in the kinds of decisions that they drive towards. And so I'm interested in why you feel resilience might be a more effective framework than, say, mitigation or adaptation in this kind of urban governance issue. Thank you.
You want to?
Maybe you could talk about the origins of it in the project title, and then I can elaborate.
Sure. So when we try to formulate this project in the first place. We think about resilience in terms of a concept that kind of like linked well with a lot of different things, right? In terms of understanding the Thinking Jakarta from hazard perspective, vulnerability perspective, risk perspective, mitigation, adaptation, and all that. So we're trying to capture all of it in terms of looking at resilience from multiple perspectives, as well as how it's linked with kind of like the state, the communities, the data, the history, and so on. So we were approaching it in a sense that in order to look into how we can strengthen, like empower resilience, we need to be able to understand all of the components. And to be able to understand all the components, we need all kind of things, really. So it becomes, it immediately becomes really complex and really political, as you might know. Even our study area is also the site of our current president, Prabowo Subianto, the floating houses. If you're aware, in North Jakarta, he was building all these floating houses. So then even the area itself is political because it's being used, for example, in the process of getting more votes during the time, and so on. We actually, the members of the team actually met, not really met him, but when he visited the site, then we kind of like it right there. And so in terms of looking at these different things, we would like to try to understand these really complex processes and to be able to untangle them in a way that maybe makes sense and could be presented, perhaps. If you know the Sumber Daya Air, so the Water Resource Agency, they have done a lot of different kind of like community effort to I don't know, for example, in social media and so on, to explain what has been happening. But aside from that, it seems that all the effort has been quite fragmented. And we want to kind of like come to be able to come from academic perspective, what is currently happening and from different perspective, and using kind of like resilience framework and linking it with all these different components in terms of kind of like urban resilience and so on.
Yeah, and I think for Ditya, who's leading the analysis of the qualitative data, resilience, and in particular everyday resilience, is a concept that's useful for him in terms of understanding how communities kind of negotiate and enact and and sort of embody resilience. But I think for me personally, outside the context of this project, like I'm not someone that would like advocate for the term resilience. I do think in the context of this project, it operates as a very useful kind of boundary object that enables us to bring a lot of people together to talk about something that we kind of, everyone sort of has an understanding of what we might mean by resilience. So I think it's sort of a strategic placeholder in that sense.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Apologies if this have been discussed before because I'm coming late, but I'm curious about the project unique approach in integrating community knowledge, especially for marginalized community, because my background is from the disabilities community and I work a lot with disabilities community as well in Indonesia, especially in Jakarta. So I just curious what the key information that community contribute on this project and what method did you use and what the challenge that it faced.
Yeah, so Ditya, our colleague, was leading with his research team engagements in two neighborhoods in two kampungs in North Jakarta, primarily with focus group discussions, but then using photo voice as a method. So distributing or having young people like 18 to 25 go out and take photos and then send them to a WhatsApp group. That didn't really work at first because it was hard to get young people to like participate in that way. But when they paired that with like doing a neighborhood walk with the youth, that was a lot more productive. And so that was part of the, basically they would walk through the neighborhood and talk about the places that they had photographed and why these places were significant. And this led to a lot of conversations that we wouldn't necessarily have expected. So they would talk, for example, about their concerns for like elderly people in the community, people who are differently abled, who might not have good access, environments that they thought were kind of dangerous. But in the same instance, they could talk about that environment as somewhere that transformed during a flood to be somewhere that was kind of like a playground for children. So it enabled us to kind of get an insight into how their understandings of places were not fixed. But also, even though we only spoke to youth, they were able to give us insights into differentiated experiences. Another story was about how they would, this kind of contentious relationship they have with security guards on some of the private reclaimed islands. So they would kind of like bundle their clothes up in plastic and like jump in the river and swim across. And, you know, the guards at PIC would tell them like, you shouldn't be here and you should leave. But they, you know, it wasn't necessarily like a violent relationship. So just, you know, and they would talk about that as something that was fun for them to do and like kind of a little bit challenging and like creating community, but at the same time was kind of sad for them or frustrating. So I think those kind of modes of engagement allowed us to kind of capture some of the complexity of their feelings about it. But I do think that we need to do more sustained, like in-depth community work. And also, like Zara said, a lot of these communities are quite exhausted by researchers. And so I think an ideal way of moving forward would be to work with people in the community as researchers and have that kind of relationship. But we need to think more about that.
Yeah, and just to add, when we went to the community, it's a very gendered space. So we had to separate the focus group discussion between kind of like men and women, just because when we put them together, it seems that the voices of the women kind of like, yeah, you cannot really hear them, but then when you separate them, then they will be able to kind of like talk. And also it's also kind of it's shown through the structure of their work as well. So the women, they are the green muscle pillar, and then the men are the fishermen's. So everything is still very like structured, gendered, and you could see that disparities. And it was also something that we want to be able to capture within the research, and also how we look into the last fisherwoman, for example. So there are a lot of nuance in terms of like gender, power, and all that components.
Many thanks to Zara and Emma for a super interesting presentation of what's clearly a really rich and fruitful research project with all sorts of things to read and learn about that I'm sure they're still working on. So thanks for sharing with us. Just to let you know, next week we have a talk by Jordana Ramayo from UCL about Cebu, and first to transform Cebu into a Singapore, Cebu City in the Philippines, and the contestation over informalities. That's Wednesday, the 18th of March. The following week, we have a talk by Janjira Sumbatpunsuri of Chulalongkorn about digital repression of pro-democracy movements in Thailand. And then we have a talk on the April 1st by Tarapi Tan, who's a visiting fellow here at the center about the 1967 rice riots in Rangoon in Burma, Myanmar. But in the meantime, many thanks again to Zara and Emma. Please join me in thanking them properly.